Hello, everyone. I'm Christian Lundblad, professor of finance at Kenan-Flagler Business School and the director of research at the Kenan Institute of Private Enterprise. Very happy to share a few thoughts with you. In particular, I want to talk a little bit about something that's come on the radar screen in an unusual fashion, and that's modern monetary theory. Maybe not something that everyone sort of would naturally lend their ear to, but I've found myself a little bit surprised that while this idea that I'm going to talk about for a moment has been sort of percolating around a little in the political spectrum, a little bit more in the economic spectrum, it's actually popping up a bit more in popular press. So a few weeks ago, I found this on the front page of an investment management journal of all places. So the idea of modern monetary theory, MMT, is to sort of look very differently at the role that the government has in spending and taxing and the creation of money and some of the constraints that they might face. So in particular, sort of the main idea is that the government kind of creates a resource, which is money, through its expenditure policy. And as a consequence then, that can create an opportunity for the government to do something compelling. And at the same time, if too much of that resource is created, it might engender some inflationary pressures. So the constraint there really is, does this amount of resource that's created yield inflationary pressures? And as a consequence, the government can then tax to sort of remove that resource from the marketplace if inflation starts to mount. And so what's sort of interesting about this, well, then fiscal policy is the critical tool. Unlike how we normally think about stabilization policy as the purview of the central bank and their interest rate policy and such, essentially the federal government can kind of create this resource or contract it through its taxation policy. And at the same time, to the extent that inflationary pressures are perhaps absent, that means that the federal government can then do some interesting things with the production of that resource in expenditure on infrastructure, energy, the environment, healthcare, and so on. And indeed, that's part of the reason why it's kind of had this rekindling, if you will, because of the Green New Deal conversation that has been so much in the political arena. I would say the most sort of superficial read of this is that look, deficits and debts don't matter, and as a consequence, then governments are unconstrained. I think the guys that are working on this from the economic standpoint are taking this a bit more seriously. That having been said, let's move aside some of the more superficial concerns, and I'm going to come back to them in a moment, and actually just ask a question about, okay, suppose this is really how it works. To be perfectly clear, I don't actually view this as the way in which I think the economy operates and the role of government. I'm struggling a little bit with understanding some of the machinery. It's either, a sort of tautology, or there are some other things that you're presuming that the government can do that I'm skeptical of. So, for example, it does presume that the government is among the more efficient operators in the provision of expenditures. So the government will systematically perhaps choose better projects than the private marketplace, or at least you're sort of disproportionately moving the pie to allow for resource allocation in that way. But here's the critical one. To the extent that taxation policy is really the operative tool in terms of managing the economic cycle and mitigating inflationary pressures, you're sort of presuming that taxation policy is a more effective and easier tool to manage than is monetary policy. And I just simply find that completely inconsistent with the political machinery that we have in Washington, which is basically incapable of making any decision on one side or the other right now. So at any rate, that's kind of where we are from that perspective. I think what has informed this conversation, though, is some pretty interesting responses that we've seen after the financial crisis and the way the economy has operated. Because let's be honest, we have created a tremendous amount of money through unusual, unorthodox monetary policy, quantitative easing, and the like. And we also have a federal government that, under two very different administrations since the financial crisis, one Democrat, one now Republican, have significantly contributed to the federal deficit. And so despite that, which you mightn't think of as sort of inflationary, we have really no inflationary pressures at all, more or less. There hasn't really been the kinds of arguments for the massive amounts of fiscal austerity, the kind of fear-mongering that has taken place in some other countries about, sort of significantly ramping down. I think we have to acknowledge that point. And the federal borrowing cost, the Treasury yield, remains remarkably low, which means that the creditors of the federal government are disproportionately still pretty comfortable lending to a government that is behaving this way. So in all these cases, I think we have to acknowledge these unexpected facts, given the things that have transpired since the financial crisis, and acknowledge that reality. That least nuanced approach, that MMT is sort of an argument that deficits don't matter and that government debt is not a concern because we don't have inflationary pressures and we're not likely to anytime soon, I would actually contend is already here. So in some sense, we've already realized that, and we've been operating as such for decades. We have zero fiscal leadership, and no party has a monopoly on this. Every single party, every single president, every single Congress that we've had now for several decades has systematically kicked the can down the road. If we care, and obviously we all have different political philosophies about what's important and how we ought to prioritize, but if we care about national security, if we care about the government's role in the provision of health care, if we care about the environment and the responsibility that we have for making sure it's safe and healthy for our kids going forward, if we care about education and investments in STEM and making sure that our youth are going to be increasingly competitive in a pretty tough environment going forward, we have to confront the medium-run challenges and the way in which we've been operating, which again is sort of the most sort of light touch, least nuanced, least sophisticated impression of MMT, has to stop. And at the end of the day, we have to confront the simple arithmetic of the problem, which is we're going to have to find intelligent ways to raise taxes. That doesn't mean we have to do it in such a way that we distort and disincentivize economic activity, but we are going to have to increase the tax base. Secondly, we're going to have to find intelligent ways to reduce our government expenditures. And we're going to have to touch everything: entitlements, national defense, other things that we might think are consequential. At present, it's important to understand where the constraints do bind. So right now, disproportionately, our deficit is financed by the foreign sector. So 40% already of marketable treasuries are owned by external governments and citizens outside of the United States. They are our creditors. And one of the key ingredients to MMT is that the reason that you can behave this way and inflationary pressures might not mount is because you can issue your own debt in your own currency, and as a consequence then, that doesn't really necessarily bite in the same way. Should we presume that we can issue our own debt at low interest rates in our own currency forever with behavior of this type? And I think it's problematic in the following sense. Already, the CBO scores that in 10 years' time, our debt to GDP ratio is going to be approaching 100%. That is, the numerator is the stock of federal government debt, and the denominator is 1 full year's worth of economic activity. And under that scenario, the servicing on existing debt, so just paying the interest on existing debt, is going to be a larger fraction of our expenditures than the entirety of the defense budget as forecast. So again, wherever you sit on the spectrum of whether that number is too big or too small, that's what we're up against. So in some sense, we're looking at a scenario that is disproportionately problematic. And here would be my lesson. Again, can we presume that the international credit community is going to allow us to behave this way forever? And for sure, for the near term, nothing is going to change. But the presumption that you can go on like this forever in the medium run, I think is stretching credulity. I would say having the risk-free asset of the world that you get to issue as the federal government, having the global medium of exchange, the reserve currency of the world, which is the United States dollar, is a responsibility as much as it is a privilege.